Hello, my name's Julie Marsh and I'm a partner in the medical negligence team at Boys Turner. Today I'm joined by my colleague Richard Moneykell, who's also a partner in the medical negligence team. Richard has been a specialist medical negligence lawyer for a number of years and predominantly works on cases involving children who've suffered an injury at or around the time of their birth, resulting in brain damage. Today we're talking about cases where a hypoxic event, where a baby has suffered a lack of oxygen, or another neonatal injury has occurred, and where a diagnosis of ADHD or autism has been made, as opposed to a more typical diagnosis of cerebral palsy that we often see in cases of this nature. Thanks for joining me today, Richard.
Hi, thank you, Julie. Yes, so really, if we start with what causes ADHD and ASD, typically it's a genetic predisposition, more often overlaid by environmental factors. And so some children who present with ASD, ADHD, there's an obvious genetic chromosomal cause. But for many children, there's no obvious link. There's no very strong family history or anything like that. And it's understood that environmental factors can switch on what would otherwise be a dormant chromosome, which would tend towards an ASD or an ADHD presentation.
And when we talk about environmental factors, what kind of thing are we talking about?
Well, we're really looking at injuries at or around the time of birth, that sort of birth asphyxia, hypoxia event, or a stroke, or a neonatal stroke, or an infective cause, perhaps meningitis, or group B streptococcus. Now, these insults cause injury to the brain cells, and a consequence of that can be to switch on a pre-existing genetic predisposition. And so a child who would develop without any ASD or ADHD traits might develop with those traits, quite often slightly atypical traits, as a consequence of the brain injury that they'd suffered.
And so what's the relevance of cooling treatment in these type of cases?
So neonatal cooling has been mainstream since about 2002. The indications for neonatal cooling are really, is there a birth hypoxic event that's been identified at around the time of delivery? The aim of cooling is to reduce the whole body temperature to between 33.5 and 34.5 degrees centigrade, and to continue that cooling for a period of 72 hours. Now, importantly, the cooling should start as soon as possible after birth, and really as a long stop within 6 hours. And the reason for this is that the cooling essentially reduces the brain swelling. It reduces the increase in intracranial pressure caused by an hypoxic brain injury. It reduces the oxygen demand from the brain cells. It reduces the release of damaging compounds from the brain cells, and it promotes brain cell healing. Now, neonatal cooling has had dramatic effects on infant survival for those that have suffered severe hypoxic events. It's also had dramatic effect on reducing the severity of physical disability and cerebral palsy, such that children whose birth indicators would suggest they would go on to develop a very severe physical injury, in fact, have very few, if any, noticeable physical traits consequent on the hypoxic damage. What that has done is that it's meant that a cohort of children that would have had severe physical difficulties don't, and neurocognitive disorders, which would otherwise be quite difficult to identify given the severity of the physical injury, become more apparent. And so what we're seeing is more and more children who have suffered from birth hypoxia, presenting either with very mild or with no obvious physical symptoms, but presenting with a label of either ASD or ADHD, sometimes slightly atypical.
And so now that that link is more clearly established, what does that mean in terms of being able to bring a claim for a child who maybe suffered a birth asphyxia or a neonatal injury, who doesn't have such severe physical presentation, but now has a diagnosis of ASD or ADHD, for example?
Well, really, the development of the science over the years, and predominantly since 2002, has meant that while doctors would be very slow to link a neurocognitive presentation, which could be explained by a genetic cause with a birth hypoxia or a meningitis or a stroke cause, there is a large body of evidence which supports the link between the insult and the development of ASD, ADHD. This simply wasn't known 20 years ago. And so parents whose children did suffer birth asphyxia, and especially parents whose children suffered birth asphyxia and then had whole body cooling, may be completely unaware that it is possible, if their child is presenting with ASD or ADHD, but without very obvious physical disability, that in some cases that presentation can be linked with the birth asphyxia. And if the birth asphyxia should have been avoided with appropriate medical care, then that opens the door to a medico-legal investigation and claim on behalf of that child. I think it's important for parents to think about that, especially as many of the cohort of children are coming up to transition stages in their education. And at those stages, it's a very good chance to sit down, reevaluate, and actually, if the support that the child needs isn't there in the state system, solicitors might be able to unlock privately funded support.
As a result of a successful medical negligence claim?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's really helpful and really useful information. So if you have any questions or concerns, or would like to talk through your own experiences so that we can see if it might be possible to assist with a case, or just to listen to any of the questions that you have around this topic, then please don't hesitate to contact one of our specialist solicitors. You can find out how to contact us in the show notes. And if you've liked this podcast, please click follow or subscribe using any of the usual platforms.